Hi there. 7-5 is all about polynomials, and this is what kind of the second half of chapter 7 will be about, is dealing with polynomials. So we have quite a few vocab words here just so we're kind of all on the same page. We start with monomial, and this is when it's just kind of a one term sort of thing. So it's a number of variable or a product of numbers and variables with whole number exponents. So a monomial might look something like this: 8x squared y to the fourth. That would be considered a monomial. In order to find the degree of a monomial, you add up the exponents of your variables, and if you have constants, they have degree 0. So we'll be working on how do we find the degree of a monomial. And then when we have more than one monomial, either added or subtracted, so let's take the one we had up there, and let's add, I don't know, 2x to the third, y to the sixth. As soon as we have more than one of them, it's called a polynomial, okay, because we have more than one. In order to find the degree of a polynomial, it's the degree of the term that has the highest degree. So that one's pretty easy. In order to write a polynomial in standard form, we just write them in order from greatest degree to least degree. And then the last one here, we have leading coefficient, and that's the first coefficient of the first term, or not the first coefficient, the only coefficient of the first term when we write it in standard form. Okay, so lots of vocab words associated with polynomials. Let's start first of all with how do we find the degree of just a monomial. Now, it said in the vocab words that when we have a constant, it has a degree of 0. So if I'm looking at this one, we have a degree of 0, a degree of 4 here, because we got p to the fourth, and a degree of 3 here, q to the third. So the degree of this monomial is 7. 0 plus 4 plus 3. Okay? Now here, again, 7 has degree of 0. Now this is e to the first, d to the first. Remember, if there's not an exponent there, it means it's a 1. So each of these would have degree 1, which would mean that this whole monomial would have degree 2. And one more here. This is just a constant. We know that constants have degrees of 0, so this one has degree 0. Okay, so that's how we find degrees of monomials. Now the next thing is polynomials. Okay, how do we find their degree? Well, the degree is of a polynomial is the highest degree that exists. So here, this term here would have a degree of 7 because 11 has 0 and this one has 7. And this one would have a degree of 3. So the degree of the whole thing would not be 10, we don't add them. It would just be the highest degree. So the degree here would be 7. Let's look at one that's a little more fun here. So here, 1/3 is 0. This is 2 and 1. So this whole thing would have a degree of 3. Over here we have a degree of 0 and a degree of 4. So that would have a degree of 4. And this would just have a degree of 0. So the degree of this whole thing is just 4 because that is the highest degree. So that's how we find degrees of polynomials. Now, let's work on writing these in standard form. Now remember that when we're doing standard form, we're just going to have one variable, and we want to write it from greatest degree to smallest. So here I have 7x to the fifth, negative 7x to the fifth. So it's going to go first because it's the highest degree. The next highest is 4x squared. It's positive, so I got 4x squared. Then I got 6x, again it's also positive, and then I got 9. So there would be that polynomial in standard form, and then it says tell what the leading coefficient is. So the leading coefficient is -7. We'll just abbreviate that LC. Let's look at another one here. So y to the 6th has the largest degree, then y to the 2nd, then -3y. So there's standard form. My leading coefficient is just 1. If there's not a number in front of the variable, we know it's 1. Okay, and one more here. Looks like we're going to start with x to the 5th. Then we got 9x to the 3rd. Then we got -4x squared. And then +16. And again, my leading coefficient here is just 1. Alright, so that's how we write a polynomial in standard form and give the leading coefficient. Now, the next thing we need to talk about, and this chart is on page 477 in your book, and it'd be a great thing for you to put it in your notes as well, because you're going to be kind of looking back at it, is we can classify polynomials based on two things. First of all, and that's this first table here, we can classify it based on their degree. So we just worked on how do we find the degree of a polynomial. And if it has a degree of 0, we call it a constant. If it has a degree of 1, we call it linear. If it has a degree of 2, we call it quadratic. A degree of 3, we call it cubic. A degree of 4, we call it quartic. A degree of 5, we call it quintic. And then 6 or more, we would just say like a 6th degree polynomial, 7th degree polynomial, etc. Then we can also name it based on how many terms it has. If it just has one term, we call it a monomial, like we talked about earlier. If it has 2 terms, we call it a binomial. 3 terms, trinomial. And then anything more than 4, we just call it a polynomial. You'll see here that quadratic, cubic, and binomial, trinomial are kind of highlighted. I highlighted those because those are your most commonly used names. So those are names you're going to want to know. So the last thing that we do in this section is we actually name these polynomials based on the charts that we just looked at. So here I look at this polynomial. It has a degree of 3, and it has 2 terms, right? 5 into the 3rd and then 4n. So if I go back to my chart here, degree 3 is cubic and 2 terms is binomial. So I would name this a cubic binomial. And that's what we mean by classify. Okay, now if I look at the next one, let's see, this one has degree 6. Not -6, 6. And 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. So if I go back to my chart, it's going to be 6th degree, and it has 4 terms, so it's going to be a polynomial. So this would be 6th degree polynomial. Okay, and one more example here. We have -2x. So this has a degree of 1, and it has 1 term. So again, if we look back at our chart, degree of 1 is linear, 1 term is monomial. So this would be a linear monomial. Okay? So that's how we classify the polynomials. So as I said before, this is just kind of an intro to polynomials. We'll be working a lot more with them throughout Chapter 7. And we'll see you tomorrow.